Pam and I have had several exchanges on emails about asking her to do this reading. And I was assuring her this morning the great thing about reading the New Testament, that the Koine Greek has almost nothing to do with classical Greek and has nothing to do at all with modern Greek. So it doesn't really matter about the names. No one really knows what Koine Greek sounded like. So I said, just refer to them as John, Paul, Ringo, and the boys. Or as long as you get Demas in, that's the important thing. It was, as I started the sermon, I thought of the old song by the Hollies, "He Ain't Heavy, He's My Brother." You know, the road is long and with many a winding. It was 1978, I believe. Let me check my notes. 1979, and I was in the midst of my brief transition in the United Methodist Church. There's nothing wrong, I need to say, with the United Methodist Church that I have a right to judge. I can only say that I was not meant to be in the system with a heavy authoritarian overlay. I just have a little bit of rebellious spirit about me. So I wouldn't have survived very long if I had stayed. But I was there, and I was required to take a course on United Methodist polity and theology at Duke. I was in the Great Dismal Swamp in extreme northeastern North Carolina, about 50 miles from where they call it Norfolk, Virginia. And it was a sizable drive, to drive across eastern North Carolina to Durham. It was a pretty boring drive, and I already was struggling with whether or not I'd made a mistake by transitioning over to the United Methodist Church. I had this little truck that wasn't comfortable, that burned oil. Well, you don't need all those details. I was just, let's say, frustrated. There's a little town called Scotland Neck. There's nothing really significant about Scotland Neck. It's like a lot of those dumpy little towns that have had better days. Nationally, Scotland Neck, you may remember, has made headlines for any number of years because it became the place for the starling, the birds, the starlings, migration, where they decided to make Scotland Neck a stop for some weeks. And no matter how hard the townspeople tried to get those birds to move, firecrackers, you name it, they tried everything. But the starlings moved when they were ready to move, and they left the town coated with, I won't talk about that unpleasantness. Just west of Scotland Neck, as I left town, on the north side of the road, I remember it so well, there was a structure. Now I have this habit when I'm in the airports and I get really bored, is I'll pick somebody out and I'll make up a story about them. I don't know if anybody else does that. It's just like, I don't know, it's a good way to pass time. So I imagine that they're here on some magnificent business. I could tell by the way they comport themselves, and I can tell by the briefcases or the computers, and I'll think of these stories. Well, I kind of did that about that structure. You see, I had a great foundation, you could tell. Work had been put in on the foundation. The framing had been put up, and even some of the, what you call the board, that's not really wood, but what is that called? Yeah, kind of the sheetrock, but this tar paper on it, that had been put up, and there was a roof on it. There was a rusted cement mixer on the east end of the house, just sitting out there. But there was never any doors or windows put into the structure. And the weeds were growing and small trees, and you could tell it was abandoned. I started wondering the story behind that house. What had happened? maybe somebody had started that house who had been engaged and was building that house for the post-wedding, the settling down. And she dumped him. Just walked off and left him, and he was left with the structure, and his heart went out of him, and he was crushed. And he never could look at the house again. Or she was all ready for the house. She had wanted a house. She was tired of renting. And so the project was undertaken, and there was a tragic accident, and he was left unable to walk. And she lost heart, and he lost heart, and the mortgage company took it and never did anything with it. See what I'm saying? You can make up all kinds of stories like that. Maybe somebody lost a job and they were banking on that income. It wasn't a real play. It wasn't the kind of place in Scotland Neck where you could get real estate offers easily, Jerry. I mean, people just weren't dropping out of the sky to take over this kind of property. I just wondered, such a great start, such a committed start, and suddenly, crushed dreams, an abandoned structure. Believe it or not, that inspired me to finish the task that I had undertaken. I didn't really want to go up to Durham every day for this, not every day, every week for this course. I didn't really even want to learn about whether John Wesley had a theology, and I still don't know if he ever really had one. I didn't want to do any of that stuff. But having seen this structure unfinished, unfulfilled, no promise left, I had to claim my persistence. And so I went and I went and I drove until I finished that stupid course just in time to begin a United Church of Christ polity class as I'd moved in the United Church of Christ. They were hard to come by the way, when I moved in the United Church of Christ. You see, I decided to take a lesson from that when you begin something, what my mom and dad had taught me was true. If you begin something, finish it. Don't walk away. Don't get frustrated and quit. And then as I was preparing the sermon, I thought maybe this was something that Demas didn't learn along the way. Demas is only mentioned in 3 different places in the New Testament. And barely as a footnote in any of these places. You probably have never heard of him. Anybody here knew about Demas before we read the scripture? Anybody? Good. You don't know whether I messed this up too badly or not, see? I could tell you a story, and you'd say, oh, man, I knew all about Demas now. You think about that. We find mention of Demas twice in Colossians and Philemon. Okay, Philemon's only one chapter, so there's not much in there to start with. All of these writings that we read may have been written by somebody else in the name of Paul, but they have a ring about Paul. And what we get from the first 2 scriptures, that Demas was an insider, that he actually had a place in the community. He was viewed to be somebody who could be depended upon. He had begun his journey well. The foundation appeared to be stable. It appeared to have substance about it. And so Paul, in writing these letters, would dare call his name amongst those who had been in solidarity with him in his suffering. The first one, he names Demas with a whole bunch of other folk, okay? We get all those names that go on, and I dare not use those names because I probably would mess them up. But he's mentioned in Colossians closely related to Luke. In fact, he gets identified with Luke in a couple of places. Now, Luke's a pretty heavy hitter. I'm sure y'all have heard of Luke. He had the right start. He was on the road. He was a significant person. Apparently, he was committed to the faith and following Jesus, and that was important. But apparently, Demas may have been in danger with the others who were standing in solidarity with Paul. But in 2 Timothy, what most people agree was getting toward the end of Paul's ministry and mission. In 2 Timothy, as Paul was in jail for the second go-round, he wrote an intimate letter to Timothy, a second letter to Timothy. He tells Timothy to bring him a parchment and scrolls. And he offers the following. You know, to be a Christian is to suffer. Now, I'm going to step aside 1 second and just give you an opinion. When the New Testament was written and Paul was lifting up the idea of suffering because of following Jesus, he wasn't talking about suffering because somebody didn't like the fact that you wouldn't bake a wedding cake for somebody. That would be viewed to be like the absurd. Really? You think that's suffering? Because you get a little public embarrassment? Strange how we interpret suffering in today's society by people who want to get headlines and think that that's about standing up for their faith because they can be exclusive of other people. Suffering meant that you were walking a line that you literally could find yourself on the wrong side of Roman justice, and that your life would be deeply threatened and you could be in prison for a long time. Paul's saying to Timothy, following Jesus means that you're going to suffer. And then, response to the suffering is to hold a steady faith. To always just be persistent. To stay at it. Don't walk away. Don't get faint of heart. You've got to stay with this journey. And finally, in the gospel of Jesus, the good news of Jesus, that's the basis for the endurance. On those days when you're not sure you can make it anymore, and on those days when the suffering is too intense, and on those days, remember the good news of who Jesus was, who came that everyone could know life, who came so that we could understand clearly who we were meant to be, created to be. That this is the good news that will sustain you, he says to Timothy. It's interesting because in closing instructions, he drops those lines that cause me such pain. Demas, in love with the present world, left me and went off to Thessalonica. An insider, somebody who had been a person that others would depend upon, somebody who would stand in solidarity with Paul in his suffering, somebody who was on his way to be the foundation of the church, one day, for whatever reason, fell in love with the present world and left me. Just left me. Sad to me. I can't help but think of Demas as that structure in eastern North Carolina I used to pass by. Someone with such promise. Someone who had dreams. Someone who had commitment. Someone representing a real future. But whatever it was, and we'll never know what it was that Paul specifically was talking about, Demas lost his way. Why? Why would he just walk away? How many of us have a little bit of Demas in us? Through the years, I've gone out to visit people because whenever people leave the church, people want to know why they've left the church. And so they always send the pastor to find out why they've left the church, because they figure that they've left the church because they didn't like the pastor. And they're thinking, well, you know, if he's not too thick-headed, he'll get it. And then he'll start looking for some other place to go. I know how that works. And oftentimes I'll go and I'll meet with someone, and sometimes people have said, well, you know, you're just not my cup of tea, except they're usually not that kind. They've gotten offended by something or whatever. And I understand how people can get crosswise with other human beings in relationship. I understand. I don't expect everybody to like me. I mean, I expect you to, but I understand how you might not. My wife doesn't like me every day. Sometimes it happens, right? But here's the thing. When I think of following Jesus, the ways of mercy and grace and love, I don't think of some stubborn, mule-headed preacher as being the reason for my abandoning the way and just quitting. Sometimes they'll say, well, it's so-and-so, or you know, it's this or it's that, or, well, you know, I gave some money and the board used the money in the wrong kind of way, or, oh, I don't agree with the denomination, or such and such and so. And so I listen, because it's important to listen, to really listen. And then again, I wonder, why would you leave your potential joy of relationship? Walk away from community. And yet it happens. All of us have a little bit of Demas in us. I've had colleagues who just got fed up and says, I'm not going to do this anymore. I can make a living doing hospice work by putting up with people who are going to live forever. I don't need to do this. And so they stepped aside and almost, in many cases, never returned to the church's community again. It's hard, isn't it? We forget along the way what's important when we get frustrated and fall in love with other passions or become disillusioned or fill in the blank. There's another hint here in 2 Timothy, though, that I would offer as an antidote. Paul writes, almost as an afterthought, get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to my ministry. Now you're sitting there wondering, so let's go back to the book of Acts and review a little personal relationship history. When Paul and Barnabas were going out on that quote-unquote first missionary journey to start new churches, to teach the people, to make disciples, Mark was along with them. It reads in here, Mark, Barnabas' cousin. Somewhere along the way, Mark kind of pulls a Demas and just walks away, leaves him. He's gone. When it's time for the second missionary journey, Barnabas wants to take Mark, and Paul says, no way. I can almost imagine Paul, because, Paul, I think, is a little stubborn and arrogant and says, I'm not taking that deadbeat with us again. He just gets in the way, and he left us. Barnabas insists. So Paul ends up linking up with Silas to take off, and Barnabas and Mark make their way in different direction. Barnabas, whose name literally means son of comfort. Paul had forgotten that when no one else would give him the time of day, when he had been persecuting Christians, when he had been doing the worst possible things imagined to those who were followers of Jesus, and then he had a conversion experience and no one trusted him, it was Barnabas who stood good for him. Because that's the spirit that Barnabas had in his heart, one of grace. Second chance Barnabas, one might say, to give others the benefit of the doubt. Barnabas was willing to do that for Mark. But Paul had forgotten that Barnabas had done it for him, and so the split took place. And so it was kind of like one of those Baptist logic things of evangelism. If you want to do evangelism, you just split a church, and then you got two churches that'll grow, supposedly. But here's the thing. Look at what Paul's saying at the very end. Oh, bring Mark. He could be useful in my ministry. The reason I raised that up this morning is this. For every Barnabas who loses passion and wanders off to somewhere else, there's a Mark who has lost his way, grew disillusioned, went on to do something else, but because someone else had patience and grace and love, he was led in paths of growth to become this one on whom others could depend. So on those days when you may be feeling a little bit like old Demas, ask God for a little help to make you more like Mark. On those days when you feel like, I feel a little weak about this today, pray that God would give you the strength and patience to persist. To keep driving to Durham, even if it is a bore. To keep working on the house because maybe someday somebody would need the shelter. To keep doing whatever it is you're doing because what you're doing may be important, not just for your spiritual well-being, but it may be crucial for others. And for the community, we need to be claiming the gift of being more like Barnabas, perhaps, than Paul. To encourage each other. To keep up with each other. To love each other. That we may grow and reach our potential, lest we fall in love with the world and abandon the way. One footnote. It's always kind of troubled me that in my heart and the hearts of some of the people I've pastored, it's always easy to get frustrated and aggravated about the Demases of the world. We need maybe less frustration and a lot more grace. A little less judgment and a lot more encouragement. And if we could find ways to do that in community with each other, the church would look a lot more like Jesus and a whole lot less of how people on the outside of the church look at us as the church. Demas may have fallen in love and took off, but I thank God that you haven't. For I do see in your eyes this morning the marks of Barnabas that have been laid claim upon your life. And for that I say, Thanks be to God.